It's always great to be back at Finovate. Welcome, everyone. I am very excited to take part in what's a new tradition at Finovate, which is the analysts up here for a short period of time. And what I'd like to talk about is something that I was very skeptical about last summer, which was 5G. Why is it that banks should even think about 5G? And my initial reaction was, well, they're going to have faster video for conversations over their phone that don't happen anyway with their bankers. So what's the big deal? Um, as I was on a panel with a large US telco and a large US bank's chief mobile architect, and who even knew that large US banks had such a thing, being engineers, they took me through this in a very methodical way and got me thinking that there were actually some pretty subtle and some pretty profound future implications for 5G. And we're going to leave aside what's happening with rollouts and who has phones right now that even work with 5G, but get bankers to think a little bit further ahead as to what the possibilities might be. And I think we've all heard about 5G. Well, what does it actually mean? Let me give you a few examples. Go back to 3G 20 years ago, and it was this pleasant road. If we could get a picture over it, it took a little while, but it was the beginnings of a smartphone. 4G got us to this nice paved two-lane road where we could start getting GIFs. That's where we are now, where you can get video over time. 5G is going to be a superhighway. And what does that really mean? I think the highway metaphor is actually pretty nice in a lot of dimensions because there are three main things that you need to think about when you're considering 5G. The first is just speed. It is fast. How fast is it, you ask? Well, 3G, to download a 2-hour movie, and who hasn't wanted to do that before they fly back against these horrendous winds to the States, would take about 26 hours, which we all had plenty of time to do, even back then. With 4G, you could now theoretically download at 100 megabytes per second in 2009, so 10 years after and 10 years before this, in 6 minutes. So that's great. That's an improvement of 260 times. 5G, you'll be able to do that in 3.6 seconds. So about 10 gigabits per second. And average times versus peak times will vary. So these are estimates right now. But that is 100 times as fast. This is a build slide, so if you wait one more second, you'll get the full slide. So doing a little math, in 20 years, that is a 26,000 improvement in performance. So that's pretty significant. Well, what does that actually mean now? Well, there are three elements to this 5G. Speed was the first. Capacity is the second. So right now, I don't know about you, but if I'm at home at about 5:30, when everyone is back from school, even on my broadband, and fiber broadband from Fios in Boston, things slow down. That will not be the case. There is just the room to put a lot more people on the highway, a lot more people in the stadium to access 5G. And in fact, at the Super Bowl, they put in temporary 5G installations. The third is latency. And latency is basically just the time it takes a stimulus to produce a response. And the reason I've got a shower up here, if you've ever been in an older home with a slow shower and the temperature's not right, you adjust it. And it takes a little while to adjust and you get impatient, so you adjust it again. And this lack of latency really screws things up. That is the same thing in 5G. The latency goes away, so there's no lag. Stimulus response immediately. So 5G, in many senses, a nice metaphor is just fiber over the air. Well, great, but what does that really mean for banks? Why do banks need that kind of speed? What could they do with it? Well, there are a few things. And also you think, well, doesn't it affect other industries more profoundly, like Internet of Things, which we talked about a little bit yesterday, and self-driving cars, where that lack of latency will really make a difference because you want two cars coming at each other to react. Or entertainment, perhaps, and media. Well, yeah, they will come first. 5G and banks are not the first in the line for 5G. But one of the things that over time is going to be really profound is that because everything turns into a thin client at the edge, the heavy computational load will be able to be done centrally, whether it's in a private cloud, a public cloud. It's a server somewhere that has a lot more hardware even than the phone in your pocket or the watch on your wrist. And look, this isn't going to happen immediately, but it's time for banks to start thinking about this infrastructural change in the future, because it's going to affect customer experience, but it's also going to affect operations in some pretty interesting ways, and we'll talk about those real quick. First of all, mobile. What does it mean? Well, we talked about that central computation, and that means that the app now on a phone, a bank's app, or a personal financial management app, becomes just a pointer to a really powerful back-end server somewhere. The native versus responsive design and hybrid will eventually become moot because the app will be so thin. Everyone will have the same version because the app will just stay the same. It's all the back-end stuff that gets modified simultaneously. Because there's no latency, this contextual advice that we have been talking about for a while and hasn't really been actualized, at least not at scale, is going to become much easier to deliver. Still not trivial, but easier to deliver. So I'm walking down the street and my favorite pair of shoes is on sale and I get the notification, blah, blah, blah. Finally, the mobile device is no longer, the computational speed isn't going to be what distinguishes the mobile device anymore. It's the radio, the camera, other hardware features, but not the processing power, because that's going to take place centrally. How about for ATMs in the branch, another pretty critical area? Well, right now for non-fiber branches, that's where the implications are going to be most profound. And there are still rural branches in the US that certainly don't use T1. A few still use dial-up, and a lot of them are still hampered by bandwidth. So you're going to have these flexible and efficient thin client branches and ATMs over time. You can have really customized ATM sessions. You can have simultaneous translation between a banker and a non-native speaker in whatever country you're in, enabled by this really fast 5G. The last mile for banks that don't have fiber is kind of rendered moot. If you can get fiber going a mile away or a few miles away and then connect via 5G, that will give that branch access to modern computational ability. And one more thing is that wearables like this are now going to be a lot more powerful because they too, as a thin client, will be calling on centralized computational power. And they'll likely be activated by voice. And if you're a shy New Englander like me, you'll need to go somewhere and speak really quietly into it. But you'll still be able to do some kinds of banking transactions, likely transactional or informational, potentially transactional. So 5G is ultimately going to turn hardware spend into data spend. And as you think about the organization chart of a bank, that's going to have some really interesting implications at budget time, and I don't want to be anywhere near that. So to be clear, this is not going to happen overnight. There are going to be obstacles. There are rollout obstacles. Apple hasn't even released a 5G phone. Does anyone out here have a 5G phone yet? One person in this tech-forward group has a 5G phone. We'll have to find each other over drinks, and I'll find out how good it is. So rollout is going to take time for the carriers, for businesses, and for consumers. Interesting fact, when they rolled out 4G in the US, the way they chose the first 26 cities was by NFL football teams because they had a lot of crowds there in demand. 4G and 5G will have to be simultaneously provided for, as well as the old apps. And there's a lot of security built in, but hackers are ingenious, and they will continue to probe at these new attack vectors. The pricing models for the banks aren't finalized. So figuring out that business model, if data now is going to be consumed at a much higher rate, is going to be problematic. Apparently lots of banks right now are pretty much like a consumer model. They go up to a certain level, and after that, they're penalty overages. That won't fly. And there'll be other issues that I'm not smart enough to figure out, but that will come out as this gets executed. So there are going to be opportunities as well that I haven't figured out. My message is 5G is coming. It's time to start thinking about it, if not implementing it. Thanks very much.